Have you ever looked back at a relationship and thought, how did I not see it sooner? Maybe you were generous, supportive, even loving, and yet somehow you walked away feeling used, not cherished. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. This message is especially for the women out there in their 60s, 70s, even 80s who have lived, loved, and learned, but are still wondering how someone younger managed to walk into their lives and slowly take more than they ever gave. Let's be honest for a moment. Many older women are incredibly strong, nurturing, and wise. You've raised families, built careers, survived heartbreak, and held everything together when life got messy. You've seen enough to know better, and yet the heart can still be vulnerable, especially when someone younger comes along with charm, energy, and just enough sweetness to slip past your guard. Now, we're not here to bash younger men or say that every relationship with an age gap is doomed. Not at all. But we do need to talk about the patterns. Because too many older women are being emotionally, financially, and even physically drained by men who see them not as equals, but as easy targets. And the hardest part? These women often don't realize it's happening until it's too late. So let's talk. Let's unpack this together like a good conversation over coffee with someone who gets it. You deserve to feel seen, respected, and valued, not used. And once you understand how this dynamic works, you can step into your power and stop the cycle before it starts. Now I want to share with you the real reasons why this happens. And not just why, but how you can stop it without losing your kindness or closing your heart completely. Let's begin with one of the most common and most overlooked reasons. It starts with loneliness. That quiet, creeping kind. The kind you feel even when you're surrounded by people. Maybe your kids have their own lives now. Maybe you lost your partner, or maybe the relationship you're in feels more like a routine than a connection. Either way, there's an ache, a space that wants to be filled. And then someone younger comes along and makes you feel seen again, wanted, noticed. At first it feels like a gift. You smile more. You look forward to their calls, their messages. You feel alive again. And that's not wrong. It's human. But here's the danger. When you're starved for affection or attention, it's easy to mistake crumbs for a feast. You overlook red flags. You give more than you should. And before you know it, you're the one doing the planning, the paying, the emotional heavy lifting, while they just enjoy the ride. You're not naive. You're human. And wanting companionship is not a flaw. But when someone uses your loneliness as a doorway into your life, it's time to wake up and lock that door. Let's talk about another reason that hits close to home for so many women: the nurturing instinct. You've spent decades caring for others. You know how to make someone feel safe, supported, and seen. And for a younger man who hasn't quite grown into his own, that kind of attention feels incredible. You're calm, you don't play games, and you know what you want. Or so you think. The trouble is, sometimes these younger men mistake your nurturing energy for an open invitation to be taken care of. Emotionally, financially, sometimes even physically. And because you've been trained to give a period, to mother, to support, you don't see it as a problem. Until suddenly, you're doing everything and getting very little in return. You're not their mother. You're not their therapist. You're not their sponsor or their safety net. You are a woman who deserves to be met with equal energy and effort. And if someone isn't bringing that to the table, you have every right to push your chair back and walk away. Now let's go even deeper. Many older women struggle with guilt around aging. Society doesn't always make it easy. You're told you're past your prime, you're invisible, you're less desirable, and that is a cruel lie. But when a younger man comes along and suddenly sees you, desires you, compliments you, it's powerful. It feels like proof that you're still worth something. But here's the trap. When your sense of worth becomes tied to someone else's attention, especially someone who may be using that attention as a way in. You're giving them more power than they deserve. You don't need anyone to validate your beauty, your wisdom, your strength. You already have all of that. So when someone shows up and makes you feel beautiful again, enjoy it. But keep your eyes open. Compliments are not currency. And love, real love, does not come with strings attached or silent expectations. Another subtle danger is the idea that this might be my last chance. That voice in your head that whispers, don't mess this up, or no one else will come along. That voice is a liar. Because the truth is, it's never too late to find connection. But it is always the right time to protect your peace. There are women in their 60s and 70s who are falling into relationships that drain them because they think they don't have time to wait for better. But I promise you this, being alone and at peace is far better than being with someone who chips away at your self-worth one charming smile at a time. And maybe, just maybe, part of the reason some of us stay in these situations is because we've been taught that sacrificing ourselves for love is noble. That loyalty means staying, even when we're hurting. That giving endlessly makes us good women. But let me remind you, being good doesn't mean being used. Being loyal doesn't mean staying silent. And loving someone doesn't mean letting them take more than they give. If you've been here, if you've ever found yourself wondering how a younger man managed to make you feel so seen at first and so empty later, you are not alone. And you're not broken. You're just waking up. You're starting to see things clearly. And that's powerful. There's more to this conversation. We're only just beginning to uncover how these patterns work, and how you can reclaim your strength, your boundaries, and your joy. When someone shows you attention after a long time of feeling unseen, it's easy to get swept up. Especially when that attention comes wrapped in charm, good looks, or a sense of adventure you thought had passed you by. But charm without character is a trap in disguise. And it's one that far too many older women fall into, thinking they've finally found something real. What's really happening is often much less romantic. A younger man who sees you as a soft place to land. Not because he loves you, but because he knows you'll catch him when life gets hard. Isn't a partner. He's a passenger. And guess who's driving the whole time? You. You're the one making plans. You're the one helping him get his act together. Maybe you're helping him pay off debt or giving him a place to stay until he gets back on his feet. You're cooking, managing, giving. And what's he doing? Flashing a smile, telling you how much he appreciates you, maybe even saying all the right things when he senses you're starting to feel tired. And then, he pulls you right back in. This cycle is exhausting. And worse, it's dangerous to your emotional well-being. Because when you give so much and get so little in return, it wears down your confidence. You start questioning your instincts. You second-guess whether you're being too harsh for wanting more. And that's exactly what keeps the cycle going. But let's pause here. You are not crazy for wanting someone who meets you halfway. You're not asking for too much when you ask for effort, honesty, and respect. And you certainly don't need to settle for someone who only shows up when it's convenient for them. Here's something else I want you to think about. And this might sting a little. Sometimes the reason these younger men are drawn to you isn't because you're older and wiser, but because you're easier to control. You're stable. You have resources. You know how to manage your emotions. You're less likely to blow up or make a scene. And while those are wonderful traits in a mature woman, in the wrong hands, they're seen as advantages to exploit. That man isn't with you because he's rising to meet your level. He's with you because he knows you won't push too hard when he slacks off. And let's be honest, you might have let a few things slide that you wouldn't have tolerated 30 years ago. Why? Because you've learned to pick your battles. Because you think, well, nobody's perfect. Because part of you believes that love means accepting someone as they are. And while that's true in healthy relationships, it doesn't apply when one person's imperfections involve lying, freeloading, or manipulating your kindness. It's not love if you're shrinking yourself to keep someone comfortable. It's not a relationship if it only works when you're the one carrying the weight. Now you might be thinking, but what if I walk away and end up alone again? And that's a real fear. Loneliness can feel unbearable sometimes, especially after you've had a taste of companionship. But here's what you need to remember. Being alone and empowered is far more peaceful than being partnered and manipulated. And don't underestimate how powerful you are when you stand on your own. You've survived so much in life: heartbreak, loss, disappointment, and yet you're still standing. That strength didn't come from anyone else. That was you. And you don't need to trade your peace just to have someone to sit across from at dinner. Let's shift gears now and talk about something many women don't even realize is happening until it's too late. Emotional manipulation. It doesn't always look like yelling or gaslighting. Sometimes it's subtle. It's guilt trips wrapped in compliments. It's, "You're the only one who really gets me," followed by excuses when he lets you down. It's him leaning on you emotionally, financially, spiritually, while offering little to nothing in return. And the tricky part? You feel needed. You feel important. And to someone who's been overlooked or underestimated, that feeling can be addictive. But here's the danger. When someone needs you more than they value you, you become a utility, not a partner. You're the emotional sponge, the fallback, the rescuer. And eventually, that dynamic starts to feel normal. Until one day, you look around and wonder how you became more of a lifeline than a loved one. It's time to flip that dynamic. You deserve to be with someone who sees your strength and admires it, not someone who leans on it like a crutch. Someone who doesn't just take from your cup, but fills it too. Because you're not meant to carry someone else's life while yours sits on pause. Let's also talk about money for a minute. I know, it's uncomfortable, but it's one of the most common reasons younger men seek out older women, and one of the easiest ways for you to get trapped. Maybe you've worked hard your whole life and now you're finally in a place of comfort. Or maybe you have a pension, a paid-off home, a little nest egg. That's nothing to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. But you have to protect it. Because when someone starts hinting that they need a little help with rent, or asks you to co-sign a loan, or suggests you go on a trip together, but somehow you're the only one paying, those are signs. And I know what you might tell yourself. It's just this once. He's going through a rough patch. I'm just helping. But if the rough patch never ends, if the help becomes a habit, and if he gets more comfortable taking than giving, you are not in a relationship. You are in a transaction, and you're footing the bill. You are not a retirement plan. You are not an ATM. You are not someone's safety net just because you've done well in life. If he's not contributing emotionally, mentally, or spiritually, he shouldn't be benefiting financially. And if you're worried about being too hard, let me remind you, boundaries are not walls. They are bridges that connect you with the right people and keep the wrong ones out. A younger man who truly respects you will never be offended by your standards. He'll rise to meet them. And if he doesn't, that's your answer. You are not too old to expect more. You are not asking for too much when you want reciprocity. You are not out of line for wanting to feel safe, cherished, and respected. What you've experienced may have felt like love at first. But love that leaves you tired, drained, or doubting yourself isn't love at all. It's control dressed up in affection. And you, my friend, deserve better than that. There comes a moment, often in quiet reflection, when you realize something isn't sitting right. You're doing all the work. You're the one checking in, making plans, making sure everything feels okay. And yet, you still feel like you're walking on eggshells? You're wondering if you're enough, if you're too much, if you're asking for things that maybe, just maybe, you should stop expecting altogether. But let me remind you, love isn't supposed to make you doubt yourself. It's not supposed to leave you feeling unsure, like you have to earn your place every day. If you find yourself constantly trying to prove that you're worthy of someone's presence, that's not love. That's fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being called demanding or too sensitive. And younger men who are emotionally immature know how to tap into those fears, especially when they sense you've been hurt before. They know exactly what to say to keep the door open, just wide enough to keep benefiting from your love, your money, your time, but never wide enough for them to step fully inside and give back equally. And that, right there, is the emotional imbalance that keeps so many older women trapped in relationships that look like love on the outside, but feel like quiet despair on the inside. So what can you do when you feel like you've given too much already? When the scales are so uneven that it feels impossible to regain your footing? The first thing, and this may be the hardest, is to stop believing that your worth is measured by how much you can do for someone else. That belief runs deep. It's been handed to many of us by decades of messaging that said, be the giver, be the peacemaker, be the one who holds everything together. But the truth is, giving isn't noble when it comes at the cost of your peace. And loyalty isn't love when it leaves you feeling depleted. You don't have to change who you are to stop being used. You just have to start choosing differently. Start with this period. Instead of asking yourself how you can be better for them, ask how they are showing up for you. Are they consistent? Are they honest? Do they give even in small ways without you asking? And here's something else to think about. When was the last time you felt deeply appreciated? Not just thanked, but seen? When was the last time someone really noticed what you bring to the table, without expecting more the next day? It's hard to face the truth when the answer is, I don't remember. But that truth is what gives you power. Because once you see the imbalance, you can stop pretending it doesn't exist. You can stop making excuses. You can stop carrying a relationship that has no legs of its own. And I want to say this gently but clearly. If the only way a relationship survives is through your constant effort, then it was never a relationship. It was a performance. And you were the entire cast. You deserve to rest. You deserve to receive. You deserve love that doesn't come with conditions or manipulation or emotional withdrawal the moment you say no. And speaking of saying no, that's where your power really begins. Too many women, especially those in their later years, struggle with boundaries. Not because they're weak, but because they were taught that saying no is selfish, that it pushes people away, that it means you're difficult or unkind. But here's the truth. Saying no is the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for your future. No, I won't lend you money. No, I won't tolerate being lied to. No, I won't keep giving when I receive nothing in return. No, I won't shrink just to keep you comfortable. And when you begin to speak from that place of self-respect, something amazing happens. You stop attracting users. You start attracting people who are drawn to your strength, not your silence. You no longer feel afraid of being alone, because you finally feel at home in your own presence. You stop waiting for someone to make you feel whole, because you already know you are. I know it can feel scary, especially if you've already given a lot of yourself away. Maybe you've spent months, even years, pouring into someone who never poured back. Maybe you've let things slide because you were afraid of confrontation, or because part of you believed you couldn't do better. But I promise you this, it is never too late to change the pattern. Never too late to draw the line. Never too late to say, I want more than this. I deserve more than this. You may lose people when you raise your standards, and that's okay. Because anyone who leaves when you set a boundary was never truly with you to begin with. They were with the version of you that was easy to benefit from, not the woman you are when you stand tall. And let me tell you something else. You are not hard to love. You are not too much. You are not asking for anything unreasonable when you want respect, consistency, and care. That's not demanding. That's called self-worth. When a younger man enters your life, it's not your job to fix him, to raise him, to teach him how to be a partner. If he doesn't come ready, emotionally mature, financially stable, spiritually grounded, that is not your problem to solve. Because love should not feel like a project. It should feel like peace. The moment you begin living from that truth, the moment you stop apologizing for having standards and start embracing your own value, you'll notice a shift. The users will fade. The noise will quiet. And you'll begin attracting people, friendships, and experiences that honor you, not drain you. And if that means being alone for a while, so be it. Because sometimes peace feels lonely at first, until you realize it's not loneliness. It's space. Space to grow. Space to breathe. Space to rediscover the parts of you that got buried under someone else's expectations. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are not foolish for having loved someone who didn't love you well. You are simply a woman who is learning, healing, evolving, and you get to decide from this moment forward how you will be treated and what you will never again allow. There's something incredibly powerful about a woman who finally decides she's had enough. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with calm clarity. The kind that comes from experience, from hard lessons, from loving and learning, and finally realizing that peace is worth more than someone else's approval. And if you're here, watching, listening, reflecting, then I know that power is already waking up inside you. You may have been used, but that doesn't define you. You may have been taken for granted, but that doesn't mean you're not valuable. What it means is that you're human. You gave, you trusted, you believed, and now you're ready to do it differently. You're not here to become cold. You're not here to shut your heart off. You're here to protect your energy, your joy, your boundaries, so that the next person who walks into your life, if they want to stay, will have to meet you with the same strength you bring. And that's what true self-love looks like. Not spa days or bubble baths, though those are nice, but the deep kind. The kind that says, period. I will no longer betray myself to keep someone else comfortable. So how do you walk forward from here? You start by slowing down. You start paying attention not just to how someone makes you feel in the beginning, but how they make you feel over time. Do you feel safe? Or do you feel small? Do you feel respected? Or do you feel like you're always explaining why you deserve better? When someone younger shows up and they're charming and funny and saying all the right things, it's okay to smile. It's okay to feel flattered. But let their actions do the talking. Anyone can whisper sweet things in your ear, but it's consistency that reveals character. Are they there when you need them? Do they contribute even in small ways? Do they ask about your day or only talk about theirs? Do they lift you up emotionally or leave you emotionally tired? These are the quiet clues that tell you everything you need to know. And here's something you might not hear often enough. Your needs matter. Your feelings are valid. Your time is valuable. You are not too old to raise your standards. You are not too late to start choosing differently. You are not past your prime. In fact, this might just be your most powerful chapter yet. The more you live, the more clearly you see. And maybe now you're finally ready to let go of the fantasy that someone else will complete you. Because you're not broken. You were never missing pieces. You are whole, even if someone else couldn't see it. Now, I know this conversation hasn't always been easy. Some of what we've talked about might have hit a little close to home. You might be thinking about a past relationship, or maybe one you're still in right now. You might be wrestling with guilt or regret, asking yourself, why did I let that happen? But I want you to stop right there. No shame. No blame. Only growth. You did what you did with the knowledge and heart you had at the time. And now that you know more, you'll do better. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. It takes courage to admit when we've been taken advantage of. It takes strength to step back and say, that's enough. And it takes real self-respect to walk away from anything that drains your soul, no matter how long you've been holding on to it. Maybe right now you're still healing. Maybe you're still a little angry. Or maybe you're just tired. Tired of giving and not getting back. Tired of feeling like you have to lower your voice, your value, your expectations just to keep someone around. Let that be your turning point. Let that tired feeling be the signal that it's time for something new, something peaceful, mutual, and true. You've earned that. You've earned the right to be cherished, not just needed. To be respected, not just tolerated. To be loved, not used. And the best part, you don't need to chase it. You don't need to bend over backwards to make someone see your worth. The right person, whether he's older, younger, or somewhere in between, will meet you where you are. He'll see your strength, not try to take advantage of it. He'll love your softness, but never mistake it for weakness. And until that person comes along, you stand tall in your own company. You take yourself out to dinner. You learn to say no without guilt. You stop rescuing people who refuse to rescue themselves. You protect your peace like it's your greatest treasure, because it is. So many women wait until their 60s or 70s to finally start putting themselves first. And you know what? That's okay, because it's not too late. It's never too late to say, I matter. It's never too late to love yourself more than you fear being alone. It's never too late to set new boundaries, to create new standards, to begin again. Not from scratch, but from experience. And if you've watched this far, I want to thank you. Not just for your time, but for your heart. You showed up for yourself today. You chose honesty. You chose clarity. You chose growth. And I hope you'll keep choosing that. Every day from here on out. If this message spoke to you, I'd love to hear your story. Have you ever felt used in a relationship with a younger man? Have you learned something about yourself along the way? Please share in the comments. Your words might help another woman realize she's not alone. If this video helped you feel seen or stronger in any way, hit that like button. And subscribe to our channel, Strong Elderly Life, for more conversations that uplift, empower, and remind you that your best years aren't behind you. They're just beginning. Here's to loving boldly, living wisely, and never again being used by someone who doesn't deserve you. You are not here to carry anyone. You are here to rise. So rise, beautiful soul, and never settle again.